Hi there, I'm David Harvey. I'm here with John Andrews, and this is the Two Texts podcast. In this podcast, we're two friends in two different countries, here every 2 weeks, talking about two different texts from the Bible. This, however, is our launch series, and so we're bringing you a daily episode of the two of us talking about the parables of Jesus. This is episode 8, and it's called Lost Son times 2. All right, John, so here we are now for part 2. We've had a lost sheep, we've had a lost coin. The whole context, as we talked about in the previous episode, is Jesus appears to be hosting a dinner party. In the start of Luke chapter 15, he's hosting a dinner party. He's invited all the wrong people and all of the right people, and I'm saying that with with quotation marks. All of the right people are a little upset at who Jesus has invited. So Jesus has rolled two what we mistakenly think are kids' parables, the lost sheep and the lost coin, and then he kind of comes in for his, I feel like, let's use a baseball metaphor, he's stacked his bases, and now he comes in to hit his home run. And that's this parable that we kind of know of as the prodigal son. Some newer translations talk about it as the lost son, and I'm noticing that increasingly modern translations are beginning to just lean it a little bit further than that, and like in my translation, it's the lost son and his brother.
Oh, that's interesting.
So,
yeah, that's interesting.
So it's a Luke chapter 15 and verse 11.
Yeah.
You want to take it away for us?
Oh, well, I'd love to.
Beautiful reading.
Jesus continued. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to the servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is now alive. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him where he was going, what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'"
It's just so good.
It's delicious. It's delicious at every level. Absolutely magnificent.
And now, so if our listeners are kind of joining in from yesterday's episode, and it's probably worth listening to yesterday's episode first before you come to this piece, because we're kind of setting a lot up in that. But I find when you kind of marinade in the first two, as we did in the previous episode, like as you're reading this story, like it's just like all the lights are coming on the dashboard, aren't they? It's just like, oh, there's that, and oh, there's this, and oh, what Jesus is doing, and you go from these two kind of quick, short parables to all of a sudden Jesus is like, now I'm going to tell you a story. And this story has depth to it. It has narrative to it. It's got dialogue. It's all in there for us to sort of just wrestle with. And where do we want to start?
Well, I tell you a thing that really helped me, David. I love Kenneth Bailey.
Yes.
And some of your listeners may have engaged with Kenneth Bailey, Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes. What a book that is.
Yes, required reading, I think, if you want to enjoy the Gospels, just go and buy a copy of that book.
Absolutely. There's some books you read and you think, I wish I'd have written that. And that's one of them. So, and Paul Through Mediterranean Eyes is another one. He wrote a gorgeous little book. I remember buying this for my father a number of years ago, because my father loved the story of the prodigal son. And so I bought a little book by Kenneth Bailey called The Cross and the Prodigal. And I read through the book before sort of giving it to my father, in terms of just helping myself understand what it was about. And there's a piece of information in there which revolutionized my thinking around this text, and that I'm so grateful to Kenneth Bailey for. And it's transformational. And he referred to something, a ceremony or an event or an experience called Keżażah. Now, Keżażah literally means the cutting off. And the idea behind Keżażah was this. In the first century, there was a custom in the world of Jesus that dictated that if a Jewish boy lost the family inheritance amongst Gentiles and then dared to return home, the community would break a large clay pot in front of him. And then they would cry out, so-and-so, the name of the boy, is cut off from his people.
Wow.
And then after that was performed, they would have nothing to do with the wayward boy. And it gets worse, right? It gets worse. If that didn't drive the boy out and the boy wanted to stay at home, wanted to sort of weather the storm, he would have to sit outside the gate of his family home until his father gave permission for him to be seen. So he couldn't just walk in the door. He would have to sit outside the front door and wait for the father to invite him in until the father actually summoned him. And of course, you're well aware of the shame culture of those sorts of worlds, where the actions of an individual shame a family or shame a culture or shame a village. This is what's going on. So now the father is shamed by the son. Because of the anger of the village, the father has to sort of replicate that anger and scold his son and make his son apologize for everything that's been done, and in the hope that he would be accepted back. But sometimes in some of the records, it suggests that the son was sent to the next village to live. He wouldn't even be accepted back. Now, when Bailey unpacked that, David, honestly, lights came on all over this story, because if the audience of Jesus knew that, and Jesus knows that, and maybe the audience members, some of them have experienced Keżażah, or because they don't want to experience Keżażah, they do not want to go home. And maybe some of the religious community have helped enact Keżażah. Then this story suddenly goes nuclear. I mean, he's gone from sort of gentle hors d'oeuvres, and then he's like whacked us with the main course, and it's full of spice. It's hot. It's burning the tongue off them. Yeah. It's just all going on. So
I love that. I love that image. We started with a prawn cocktail, and now Now it's a habanero chili.
Absolutely. Suck on that, lad, and see if you can manage not to cry or run to the
Yes.
toilet at the same time.
Yes.
I think if we accept Bailey on this, which I'm happy to do,
Yes.
I think it's like Jesus is going nuclear on this, and suddenly you're into a dramatic story that has nuance that just touches everybody in the room.
Well, you don't even need to have seen Keżażah. You just need to know it exists and to hear about it. I mean, it's interesting that we have this in our recent history, don't we? So, some years ago, I had a friend, and his wife was talking to me one day after church, and her family member, I think it was like her great uncle or something, had just passed away, and he had, because of his faith during the Second World War, had chosen not to fight and became a conscientious objector. Now, what was fascinating about this man is he had to go to court to defend himself, and he had to do, the kind of, to prove that his faith was leading him to object to fighting. But once it was accepted that yes, he wasn't a coward, it was that his faith prevented him from fighting, the shame in the village that he lived was massive, to the extent that it made the local newspaper that he had been classified as a conscientious objector, and it was listed in the obituary section. Like wow. And so, like, why I tell that story just now is that we have relatively recent modern examples of public ceremony that says this person's behavior is unacceptable to us, and we're now going to shame them, and we have things that we can do. And this man then lived with this for a long, long time in this village of oh yeah, that's him. So roll that back into Jesus' time. What I'm saying is it's not unknown to us that cultures exist of things that we do and of things that we don't do. Does that make sense? That we sort of, so I find it complete. I mean, the evidence of Bailey's work is that he knows what he's talking about. But then even to listen to it, you think, yeah, this is brilliant. And what it really is clever is that Jesus kind of goes, well, imagine if you lost a sheep. Imagine if you lost a coin. And then he goes, oh, what about this story? And he sort of, are you sitting comfortably? Because now I'm going to throw in a story that just gets to, I mean, the best, I think if I was paraphrasing this, there was a man who had two sons, and the younger of them came to his father and said, Dad, I wish you were dead. Because that's how you normally get your inheritance. You have to die. And essentially this young son is saying, you're not dying quick enough, Dad. That's which is like, even in our society, which is way more individualistic and way more driven by personal concern rather than, family kind of qualities. Like, this is a horrendous, like, none of us would ever dream of saying this at some sort of level. And yet here Jesus starts this story with this. And then crazily enough, the father does it.
Amazing.
He actually, and there's some reference, I think, that if the son insists in this sort of kind of context, if the son insists that, no, I will not apologize, this is what I want. I've read some scholars who have suggested that when the son is given his inheritance and leaves, the family would hold something of a funeral service then, and would, whatever of his belongings they could find would kind of get wrapped up and buried. And there is some people, and I wonder sometimes there's a bit of parallelomania going on in this, where people are trying to make the parable work too neatly. But this sense of almost, this declaration, your son is now dead to you, in that sense. And and it's interesting, just to jump to the end of the parable for a moment, because it's worth mentioning that when there's this little tete-a-tete between the dad and the second son, the dad says, all I have is yours. Which is true. Like, you have everything, because the rest of it's gone.
Yeah.
He took it and he spent it all. So there's we need to come back to that as we close the parable off. But it's a really interesting point that the parable holds its consistency there, that there is now only half left. And and is that perhaps one of the problems that the older son has? Like, do I now have to share this again a second time with this reprobate that has just turned up and come back? But the nuance of this parable is phenomenal, right? So in the first two parables, we get little nuance. There's a sheep, it gets lost. Yep, we know that. There's a woman, she loses a coin. We've all done that, right? In my household, losing keys and wallets is just an almost daily occurrence. And I dare say that I'm not alone on this. So
You're
it's
not alone.
like, yeah. So there's like, yes, totally that. And then we get into this multi-layered story and everything about it. Like Dad, I wish you were dead. Right. Okay, I'm taking everything I got. A few days later, like he didn't even hang around to say goodbye, really. It's like, I'm off now. And he travels to a distant country and he squanders his living. Like, it's just, Jesus is just master storyteller here. And then, of course, a severe famine took place in that country. Like, you almost get this resonance with some of the early stories of Israel and stuff like that as well, of how did, Israel went off in different countries and a famine hit them and everything like that, but then he hires himself out to one of I can only assume that this other country he's in isn't Israel. Right.
Yeah.
And of course the evidence of that now becomes brutally apparent because he gets a job with pigs. It's not even, it's bad enough. So he's Dad, I wish you were dead. I'm off. I'm not even hanging around. And now I'm going to live a reprobate sort of lifestyle. Then it turns out, I'm in a foreign country and now I'm going to go and work feeding pigs. It's just like it's like a Jewish disaster story.
Absolutely. It is. And I think this is where, for me, the Keżażah context really was enlightening, because if you follow why they did Keżażah and you follow the mentality to it, this story ticks every single box in that. So he's thoroughly distasteful as a young man, and then he says to his dad, I want you dead. He liquidates the portion of the estate really quickly and turns it into some form of, traveling cash and collateral. He travels to a distant country, clearly a reference to a Gentile context, and blows the whole thing on what the text calls wild living. Now, his older brother will insert his own view into what wild living looks like later on. But of course, remember, this is Jesus telling a story. This is a parable. Jesus is making all this stuff up. But then again, when the young man comes to his senses, look at the language. He's actually sorry for what he's done. And then he says, he talks about, make me one of your servants. He's not even expecting to be received back as a son, which is really dramatic. And it explains why, because I've sometimes read it and thought, well, all right, the boy went and had a bit of a full-on holiday. He's blowing stuff, but he's still loved. But of course, if you layer into that a cultural understanding of Keżażah, then the boy already knows, I'm stuffed. I'm going to go back here and I'm going to have to go through this and I'm going to be humiliated. And so I'm just going to get ahead of the curve and say, I'm really sorry. Can I be one of your servants? I'll be really happy with being a servant because I know I can't be your son again. And I think then that explains the actions of the father. The father saw him. Now, when I used to read this as a wee boy, I'd read the actions of the father because I had a great dad.
Yes.
And my dad, who's now gone, he's passed on. My dad was just a wonderful, generous, gorgeous, beautiful man who was everything you would want a dad to be. He was just fantastic. So when I used to read this, I would just think of my daddy, my daddy standing at the front door of our house in Belfast and looking up the street because he's looking forward to his son coming. But then when I read this through Keżażah, I'm thinking, well, the reason he's watching is because he wants to get to his son before the villagers get to him. That's the reason he's watching. He's not just watching because, I wonder where Johnny is today. No, he's going, right, I've got to get out there before. And of course,
the mob get him.
before the mob gets him. And of course, he runs, which, an elder man in a Jewish culture would never run.
Yeah.
So he runs. So the fact that he's running, everybody's going, "Where's he going? What's?" So they're probably, his actions are probably drawing attention.
The whole scene's
And then
wrong, isn't it? The whole scene.
everything's wrong.
Yeah.
It's all wrong. And I love this, David. This is a bit I just wanted to get to. Two wee things. It says, the NIV says he threw his arms around him. Literally, the Greek text is he fell on his neck. Which there's a beautiful allusion to that in the Torah. And I think Jesus is making the story up. So I think Jesus is drawing Torah imagery into the story. And of course, one of the most dramatic falling on your neck moments, well, there's three actually in the book of Genesis. There's Esau falling on the neck of Jacob, which is quite striking as one. There's Joseph and Benjamin. Joseph fell on the neck of Benjamin. It's gorgeous. And then, of course, the most dramatic father-son one is Joseph and Jacob when they meet up again. A lost son, an estranged son, an exiled son, a son who...
Well, it's beautiful, isn't it?
Isn't that gorgeous?
Well, especially if that resonance that I picked up in the first place of almost that, a son went off to a distant land and there was a famine.
Indeed.
If there's Israelite story of Egypt and slavery going on, allusions in that's amazing, John.
Isn't that it's potentially like goose pimply, isn't it? It's sort of, you go, ooh, now maybe that's us just getting overexcited and seeing something that isn't there. But isn't it dramatic? It's, and unfortunately the modern translations, because English doesn't, like, what does that mean, fall on your neck? It sounds a bit weird. I think the old King James translates it fell on his neck, actually. But modern translators have softened that, and in softening that, we've lost that nuance, a direct Torah nuance, which is a power. And every Pharisee in that room would just know that. Boom, they've got that right there. That's a dramatic idea. And then a beautiful look and a nuance. And then I'll pause for a wee moment, let you jump in. But it says he fell on his neck and kissed him, kataphileo. And Dr. Luke uses that word in very similar forms 3 times in his text. The woman who kisses Jesus' feet, it's kataphileo in Luke 7. And the elders who kiss Paul before he leaves them is kataphileo. It's an incessant kissing. It's something passionate. It's not just the kiss of greeting. It's the kiss that's coming out of his compassion for him. He feels something deep within him. And so when the father's running, he's not running to welcome the son. He's running to save the son. and I think, David, that's why he says, so did you notice in the text, the son then repents and goes through his speech. And the father doesn't even respond to the speech. The father just goes, quick, he says, quick. Get the robe put on him. Why does he say quick? I think Jesus is playing on Keżażah. It's because the village is coming. The villagers are coming. I can see one of them's got a clay pot in his hand. The villagers are coming. Quickly, get the robe on him, get the ring on him, get the shoes on him, because once the robe's on him and the ring's on him, they cannot touch him. Yeah. And so the father runs to save him. And I can't describe my excitement at those nuances in the text and the message of Israel as well as the message of the individual.
It is just phenomenal. I don't want you to stop. I want you to keep talking about this. The narrative, the way that Jesus tells the narrative is so good. From, again, I just keep repeating myself, but from the quick, short, sharp parables, now we have a parable where the son says, so I'm going to go home and I'm going to say this. And you actually then get him saying this. You don't get that often in parables. Often it's like the narrative is shortened and abbreviated to kind of add to the punch. But, it's word for word. Father, I've sinned against heaven before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And what's interesting is the father cuts him off before he gets to the, now you're going to treat me like one of your hired servants. The father cuts in on that. But then, let's just push with Bailey for a moment there. Isn't it really interesting that the father, not only does he get to the son before the village, but he then completely bypasses the mechanism, right? So, and I can't help but feel resonances of Jesus here, right? So there's outsiders, tax collectors and sinners. We don't like these people, but there is a way. There is a way through Torah for them to sort themselves out and come into the house. There is a way for them to be. If they do this, and the next thing, then we can be okay. So we flip back into that kind of, if you behave, then you can maybe belong, right? And the father, so the father could, enjoy being in the gaps of the parable. The father could run out to the son and say, Johnny, you're home. So, right, let's just work that. So I've got a comfy seat for you because I love you. There's a comfy seat at the gate, right? And you're going to come and sit at it, and everybody's going to see you there, and you're going to make your apology. I've heard half your speech. You're going to make your apology again, and then I'll come out, and I'll say you're forgiven, and then the servant will bring out your cloak, and we'll work through the process. So there is a mechanism to sort this out, and the father just steamrolls the whole thing, right? And he just says, nope, here's your cloak, here's your ring, and you just can't help, like I'm drawn to Jesus on the cross, and everybody's hurling insults at him. And Jesus says, Father, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing. Like you can't help but surely not think there's something of that going on in here, right? That there's this is the gospel now. This is grace being presented to us. You can choose your speech, work on the best speech you have. Go on, give it your best shot. And Jesus just isn't going to let you finish it. Because your speech is nonsense, right? Because your speech forgets who the Father is, right? His speech forgets that you can have systems and policies and social pressures and honor and shame and traditions, and the Father says, no, he's still my son, and it's awesome. Like, it's just phenomenal.
It truly is. And I think if we allow our imaginations to run a wee bit more as well, if Jesus is painting, I mean, if we're picking up the vividness of this picture 2,000 years later, what would it have felt like in a room where everybody knew what this thing was? And, the dramatic moment where by the time the villagers, because it says the boy was a long way off. So by the time the villagers get to the father and the son, let's imagine the robe's already on him, the ring's already on him, the shoes are already on him. Slaves were barefooted, but never sons. And the crowd has gathered, and the father, with an arm round the son, walks through the crowd. And I go, and somebody in the crowd has the clay pot ready to smash it, and the father just silently is saying, we won't need the pot, because here's what we're doing. We're going straight home. And he says to his servant, get that fattened calf. We're going to have a party tonight, and we're going to celebrate. And I think there is a nuance. This son of mine who was dead, because he was dead to the village. He was dead to that culture. He was dead. He's not dead. He's alive. And you're not going to punish him, and I'm not going to punish him, because he's now found. And you could just imagine the stunned silence of the crowd as the boy is escorted through the crowd, and they're watching him disappear into the Father's house. And I can just hear the Pharisees stand there go, but that's not right. That's not fair. That's not what should be done. And of course, they're right. Yeah. That's not what should be done. The process says he should be punished. Yeah. But Jesus is telling this beautiful story in a bypass of the process to say, no, you're home. You're welcome. Come in. I just am shocked by that. I'm
well, grace, grace is, grace should be illegal. It's you're absolutely right, aren't you? It is wrong, and bear in mind, there's this underlying, heaven has great joy when one sinner repents, more than 99 who are already righteous. Mm-hmm. The danger of righteousness is that it can become self-righteousness, and then we want everybody to jump through the same hurdles that we had to get to, don't we? And it strikes me, John, as well. Let's just keep pushing the background that we know is going on here. I go to the supermarket, much like you do, and to my own discredit, perhaps, meat arrives in my house in styrofoam, polystyrene packages. And so, here's your meat for tonight. Here's 2 steaks, and then today it's some cubed beef because I'm making a chili. And today it's some ground beef because I'm making hamburgers. Do you know how many quarter pounders are in a cow? Here's a question for you. This is like, do you know how many quarter pounders, like McDonald's quarter pounders, right? How many quarter pounders are in a cow?
I have no idea, David. I've never been asked that question.
It's a fantastic. The average cow is like 1,200 pounds, right? That would be your average steer, right? Which apparently produces something in the region of 450 to 500 pounds of usable meat, right? Of what we call beef, right? Which means that there's like generally an average. So I did a quick Google and said how many burgers, and this is the answer I got. Quarter pounder burgers, you're going to get 1,800 from a cow, right? So, right, it's like just to rescue the podcast from moving off into the what on earth are we talking about now? The father is inviting the whole village to the party, right?
Come on.
Now, we're going to jump ahead for a little moment because I want to give the second half of the parable the credit. But look at what the younger son says. You didn't even give me a goat. So, the number one problem, it's all yours anyway. So why don't you just take a goat? But a goat is probably about enough food for 20 or so people, right? But a cow is enough. A cow is enough food. A cow is enough food for 1,800 burgers, right? So you've got this. So let's just again live in the imaginative zone for a second. Okay. Oh, look, here he is. He's here. Right. I'm going to run because I've got to get to him before the village and the pot and the mob. Right. So I'm getting there, and again, I'm filling out. This is the kind of Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings extended cut of the Lost Son, right? But so the father gets out and he says, right, no, here's your. I'm not interested in your speech, right? We don't have time for the speech. we have time to kill a cow, but we don't have time for a speech. Here's your shoes. Here's your ring. Here's your cloak. Oh, now the crowd have caught up with us. We've got the pot, right? We've got the stool, and the father says, how about instead we have a party? and you're all invited. It's like, I love it. It's just brilliant because heaven has joy about something that is lost and is found. So is there a resonance there that says when something lost is found, the deeply theological response to that is party.
Absolutely.
It's like,
that's beautiful.
And you're all coming.
You're all coming. It's
so
beautiful.
I'm not imagining these people sat with their kebab and going, well, this is a mess, isn't it? But at least the food's good.
and of course, when the older brother comes in, he not only hears the sound of the music, but did you know the sound of the dancing? So there's clearly it's going on. There's a lot of stuff going on there, and they are having a jolly old time. And doesn't that relate back, David, to what you said yesterday in the previous podcast? Rejoice with me.
Yes,
and that's exactly the nuance that the father does say to the son. He says in verse 32. Look at the language, how it's. But we had to celebrate.
Yes,
we had to celebrate and be glad, and that leans into the imperative of rejoice with me. Yes. We had to celebrate and be glad.
It's the rules,
absolutely. So the father has embraced the rules of the previous two parables. Rejoice with me, a command. Lean into that, and then he says we had to celebrate and be glad. And the word glad literally is the same root word there as rejoice with me. It's that beautiful idea of celebrate with me. And you've got that. And of course, again, sorry, but I love the little nuance of the sort of fattened calf idea, because it sparked a thought in me right back to the Torah again, where Abraham is entertaining God well, at least God in some sort of human form. We might call that a theophany. Some may even think a Christophany there. It's God in some sort of human form and maybe two angelic beings, and they're all in human form. And of course, the Lord's about to drop the amazing news that Sarah will have a baby this time next year. But what does Abraham do? He rushes to prepare this calf, tender and good,
Mm.
enough food for us all, and a beautiful thing happens in the context of food together, in the context of hospitality and welcome, in the context of celebration. A word of life is given. Your wife this time next year will have a baby, and it's in the celebration that life is released, isn't it? That ultimately there's something, because when they celebrate this returning boy, something's going to change in them,
Mm.
right? So like 6 hours before, they were the lynch party.
And now they're dancing.
Now they're dancing. So the fact that they have followed the imperative, rejoice with me, has changed them. They've now changed potentially in seeing this son completely differently and seeing the outcome of this process completely different. And it's interesting, it's the person not at the party at this moment who has the biggest struggle entering it.
You can be at the party and not be at the party. Which, like, just draw all back out again for a second. Jesus is hosting a party. The wrong people are there, and the religious experts come and they start to grumble. And Jesus goes, let's tell some stories. The story ends with, you can be at the party and not be at the party.
Totally.
Like I loved that. Like I had written on my notes here, John had to celebrate, and I had underlined like 5 times. Like it's, rejoice with me. Exactly as you said, it's an imperative. And then this story, you see them living that out. So there's this exciting moment that verse 25, this is heaven, right? This is heaven on earth, which is what Jesus is always calling us to look for and see. That there's too much thinking about how do we get away when Jesus is saying, how do we get the rule of God and the reign of God here? And like grace, does grace have rules? Well, you've got to be careful, because if grace has rules, it becomes law. But if grace has a rule, here it is: celebrate,
yeah. Celebrate.
Party. Now, what's interesting, John, in this, and I'm just kind of pulling myself back together because I'm a bit emotionally wrecked by the last couple of minutes, but interesting, the first parable ends with rejoice and celebrate because I found my sheep that was lost, right? The second parable ends with rejoice with me because I found the coin that was lost, right? Mm-hmm. But interestingly, this parable at verse 24, at what we'd almost call the middle, or at least it's not the end, rejoice because what is lost is found, right? So there's almost a sense that there might not even be 3 parables here, they might be 4 parables. Because now we get a 4th story, and it almost starts again. Now there's an elder son, and he's in the field. He all of a sudden, up until now, we just knew that the man had 2 sons, right? And we don't even know where the second son is. We don't know anything about that. But all of a sudden he enters, and you get this sense then of the second story beginning. And it's mimicking the Jesus meal scene, like in real, kind of contrast. In Tom Wright's, reading of this, he always calls it the parable of 2 sons. Totally. Because now a second story starts, and you've got this kind of nuances that are really worth kind of explaining and engaging with. He hears what's going on. He hears music and dancing. Like it's beautiful that you mentioned that, because I was so excited when I saw that myself as well. That it's like, whatever has gone on, these people have decided, that ceremony we were planning wasn't that fun anyway. So let's get beyond that. And he hears it, right? And and think about this, John. Just his elder son was in the field, right? Yeah. He was in the field. I knew somebody once who came from a background in the church, which I respect. I'm not wanting to have a go at their background. Please, hear me well. But their background was that they didn't drink alcohol, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they had never drank alcohol. They were an older person and they'd never drank alcohol ever in their whole life. But I remember I was visiting them one day with a friend, and as we left, I remember saying to my friend, for somebody that never drinks alcohol, they talk about it a lot, and to the extent that I know people who do drink alcohol don't talk about it as much as this person that does drink. And you almost, if I was older and braver, I'd have maybe said, maybe you should try some sometime, right? And I sound like I'm being disrespectful, and I don't mean it that way. But when they talked about it, it was a sense of, but look at me, I've been working hard never to drink my whole life, and all these people who are just out there drinking and doing that. And that kind of religious attitude can come in. And I love Jesus's nuance here of, he was in the field, So they're partying and he's working hard. What a brilliant capturing of what can get into our hearts sometimes,
Totally.
There's another parable which we must talk about in this series, of the workers, the vineyard workers, and wait a minute, I've been in the field all day and you're gonna offer this guy that came for an hour, you're gonna offer him what now? It's this same attitude again. It's this sense of, I just love that nuance of he was in the field, right? He's just, you can be working hard, doing all the right things for all the right reasons. But then when you encounter grace, it's just offensive to you.
It's true. It's so true. And I think it leans beautifully, David, into Jesus, especially in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus' relationship with the religious community. I used to have the privilege of teaching at the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts at our denominational Bible college. And I used to try and describe Jesus as a sort of a charismatic Pharisee, that at a theological level, Jesus and the Pharisees were actually very, very similar.
100%, hugely so.
Yeah, and it's interesting. He never really criticizes them for their theology. It's very rarely he more criticizes them for their practice. And that's where and of course, interestingly, they largely criticize him for his practice. And I think you get this beautiful cat and mouse situation in the Gospel of Luke, especially, where they're like following him everywhere and they're clearly trying to save him because they think he's a decent bloke. He's, Nicodemus, Sanhedrin member. We know you're a man come from God. So there's a whole bunch of them think this guy's pretty good, but they can't work him out. And so they sort of like what he's about, but they really cannot stomach his behavior. So they're trying to save him. Ironically, of course, Luke's gospel shows us he's trying to save them. And there are many meal moments that, there's as many, depending on how you count, you could have as many as 11 or 12 dinners or meals in the Gospel of Luke. But if you wanted to look at the big missional ones, 6 stand out. And Jesus has 3 dinners with sinners, absolutely identifiably sinners. And then he has 3 dinners in the houses of Pharisees.
Beautiful symmetry, isn't it?
And it's a beautiful symmetry. And I would argue that Dr. Luke, in his genius, includes the symmetry because of those 6 meals, 5 of them are unique to the text of Luke, right? And I think if you're prepared to follow my breadcrumbs, and I think I followed Dr. Luke's on this, I think then when you get to Matthew 15, you have something of that symmetry in play. And Jesus is surrounded by, if you like, the pig-hugging son. He's surrounded by the sinners who should get Keżażah and won't under his leadership and shepherdship, as it were. But then you've got the religious community who are like the elder son, working hard, serving the Father. Now look at the language. Now remember, Jesus is telling this parable, so he's putting the words into the mouths of the sons. He's creating these words. Now look at the words that Jesus creates around this. It says of the son, he became angry. I think that's an echo of the Pharisees murmuring in verse 2, which you picked up on brilliantly, yesterday. In verse 30, he says to the Father, "This son of yours." Look at that language. I mean, I had a brother and a sister. I'd never describe my brother as this son of yours. I would say he's my brother. But if Keżażah has kicked in, then he doesn't have a brother.
It's
His
the
brother's.
language of divorce, isn't it? You
It
hear
is.
this, as a pastor, I've encountered a lot of, marriage breakdown, and you hear it. So you have mom and dad and child, right? And mom will talk about dad as, hey, dad says this, and hey, mom says that, and then a divorce happens, and you hear parents talking to their children going, hey, your dad
Your
said
dad.
this. It's an
Yeah.
amazingly powerful pronoun just to throw in there, isn't it? So we see
Yeah.
this in our lives as well.
Oh,
Your
totally.
son, not my brother.
Yeah.
Your
Yeah.
son.
Yeah.
Oh goodness.
And I think, I think Jesus is deliberately crafting that language, this son of yours. And then look at verse 20, and you've alluded to this. I think this is just powerful because it connects the field idea to what now he says. He says this, verse 29, I think this is tragic and powerful. He says to his father, all these years I have been slaving for you. And then he goes on to say, and I've never disobeyed your orders. Now, if I didn't know that was a son speaking, right, I would think that's an employee speaking. That's a slave speaking.
Yeah.
He's a son, but he doesn't sound like a son at that moment. And could it be, David, and I could be pushing this too far, could Jesus be just leaning towards the Pharisees gathered that night at his dinner party and saying, listen, boys, you know the Torah off by heart, but the danger is it's become slavish, it's become orders, it's become swallowing gnats, straining gnats, and swallowing camels. You're missing the heart of the Father in all of this. And I think that language, so deliberately chosen by Jesus, so forensically chosen, is, well, it moves me deeply. I think Jesus, I want to imagine, and I know some of our listeners will say, John, shut up now, but I want to imagine Jesus with tears in his eyes as he says, all these years I have been slaving for you. And how does the Father respond? But the Father says, but all I have is yours. And he's that's why it is the parable of the two lost sons, because the elder son doesn't sound like a son.
Yeah.
He sounds like an employee. He sounds like a member of the estate. And I think Jesus is appealing to the lostness of the sons that believe themselves found, the religious community. And he's saying, listen, you're not slaves and you're not obeying orders. This is about celebrating with heaven. And I think there's something deep in the overall language of Luke and in the overall appeal of Jesus to the religious community in the Gospel of Luke. And I think this is one of the focal points of that argument in this parable.
And then if we kind of just for a moment leaf over to Luke's friend Paul, you get Philippians chapter 3, right? So hold that narrative of the son, I have been slaving for you. I've never disobeyed your command. And Paul then says of himself, he's like, hey, listen, you want to talk about confident background? Here's mine. This Philippians 3:5, circumcised on the 8th day, member of the people of Israel, tribe of Benjamin, Hebrew of Hebrews. As to the law, well, I was a Pharisee. As to zeal, I persecuted those Christians, the church. As to righteousness under the law, blameless. Paul says. The young man says to his father, I've been slaving for you and I've never disobeyed your command. And yet the young man says, but you've never even given me a goat. Paul says, I was blameless. Yet whatever gains I had, these I've come to regard as loss because of Christ. More than that, I regard everything as loss because of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. So you now get this kind of Paul crashes into grace, and realizes actually all of this defense that I've put together is just worthless, And this is why I mean the Luke Paul theology crossover. A lot of times people talk about Paul as if he's hard to correlate with the Gospels. I just find him so easy to correlate with the Gospels. Like all these years I've been working like a slave for you. You've never disobeyed your commandment. And you've never even given me a goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when the son of yours came back and devoured all your property with prostitutes, like you say, like he fills in, like he's been in the field the whole time, but he apparently knows exactly what his brother has been up to. Right? And you killed the fattened calf. And then the father says, son, you're always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It's like, Paul's like, I realized it was lost. And then he goes on in Philippians 3 to say, because I realized Jesus had already grasped hold of me. Like son, you wanted a goat, you have a goat whenever you want. You have a cow whenever you want. It's all yours. Like the fact that you thought that working for me was slaving, actually you were the son of promise. You were the son of inheritance. You had everything. You just chose not to live in it. And now you can't help but think the Egypt story, the falling on the neck of Jacob and Joseph, like, goodness, these tax collectors and sinners, like you can't help but think that now Jesus is absolutely echoing the Israel story for them. You have everything of God's, and you're trying to bind it up and keep it to yourself when it was always designed. The Abraham story, you will be a light to the nations, you'll be a blessing to the Gentiles. And so this resonance with Philippians to me is so powerful, John, because there's that sense of this is what grace looks like. That John Barclay, brilliant scholar in Durham in England, he always talks about how grace bankrupts your previous economies. So you're there trying to roll out, I did this and I did that and I did the next thing, and the problem is, it's like, you and me are old enough to remember when the euro came in Europe, and then there was that moment where you opened your drawer, Michael McIntyre, the comedian, talks about the man drawer, and you open your drawer and now you realize, I've still got lira and I've still got some francs, and they're worthless now, and it's like that. Well, I've been in the field. Well, who cares about the field when there's a party going on? Paul's like, I was a Pharisee of Pharisees, but when you meet Jesus, you realize, oh goodness, that economy doesn't happen anymore. The grace fundamentally alters the structures of the way that we think. And I can't help but see that contrast between one son, Father, I have sinned against you, make me like one of your servants. And the other son, I have been slaving away the whole time. There's little lines drawn between the two there, isn't there?
It's totally genius. And again, what really touches me, moves me, is that Jesus is crafting the words, and he's crafting the words in front of an audience that are both sons. The audience is made up of the inheritance grabbing, pig smelling younger son.
Yeah.
And an audience that's made up of elder sons that are good people. I mean, good people. Nicodemus was a good man. These are good people. They could recite Torah off by heart. They have devoted themselves to protecting God and to protecting the text. And they are decent, upright, good people. But they are lost. Yes. And the grace of heaven is right in front of them. Everything they claim to believe is right in front of them. And they're so obsessed in carrying out Keżażah that they're missing the party. And of course, tragically, gloriously, mysteriously, there's no finish to this parable. What happened next? And Jesus deliberately leaves it hanging.
This is the parable that doesn't have celebration. The fourth parable doesn't have, it has the instruction, but it doesn't have the answer, right?
Yeah, it just hangs there. What did the if I'm sitting in the audience of Jesus, and Jesus finishes there, I'm going, so what did he do? What did he do? What did the elder brother do? Did he join the party? there's a sense in which Jesus leaves that hanging there, and he's literally saying to the elder brothers in the room, well, what are you going to do? You going to join this party? You going to join me? Or are you going to stay outside the party and miss the fun? And I think it is a dramatic appeal. I think there's, we if we're prepared to read this with a tender tone and have a tonation at the end of this of tenderness, then I think you hear a tender appeal from Jesus to the elder son. The pig-hugging sons have got it. They're all there. They're there because actually they get it. This guy's not breaking pots. This guy's mending lives. So we're in. We're in. So they don't need to be convinced to join the party. They're taking that option. But Jesus, actually, I would argue, almost the point of this parable is not the main focus, often the prodigal son. The point of this parable is actually the elder son. Please
100%.
join the party. Join the party. Come on, cross the line, sit down, have a glass of wine with me, enjoy these olives that we bought especially for this evening, and join the party. Rejoice with me.
And that's the thing about Jesus. I think the genius of these 3/4, 3.5, parables is that you realize he's done something really clever. Parable 1, look at these sinners. Parable 2, look at these sinners. Parable 3, look at these sinners. Oh, wait, look at yourself, and he just spins it back around on them, doesn't he? And I think this is where you realize what's been going on is that, I asked the question yesterday. This parable poses the question, who's actually lost, and you can be lost and still at home. You can be lost and not go away. You can get completely off track. Eugene Peterson, the great Eugene Peterson, in my opinion, he talks about iatrogenic illness in one of his books when he's talking about these parables. He talks about I'm trying to remember the name of the book that Peterson cites now, John, which is terrible because I was just reading it just the other day there in The Word Made Flesh, and he talks about iatrogenic illness, which is basically iatro. You would know that the Greek word for doctor, right? And so iatrogenic illness is when you go to the doctor to be healed of something, and in the process of being healed of that something, you develop a new disorder, right? Wow. So like superbugs would be an example of that. You were ill with this, you went to hospital and you got ill with something else. And unfortunately, the something else you're ill with is now worse than the thing you got in the first place, right? And Peterson talks about this the parable as the challenge of iatrogenic illness. That the phrase he uses is, there are some sins that you only catch in church, right? And so this son, I'm out in the field, I'm doing everything right, everything's great that I'm doing, you shouldn't be it, but a new sin has developed, right? And the new sin that's developed is I can't believe you're doing that to them.
That is so good, David. That is so. I've never heard that phrase before, but like, certain sins you only catch in church. That is so good. I mean, that literally does it. Yeah, because like as I said before, I think there's a Pharisee in us all, and he's lurking. And like being of a Celtic disposition as well, I think I'm more prone to be slightly sort of black and white and a bit dogmatic and I've literally genuinely I've had to try and train my heart away from that, not lose the strength of that ability, but train my heart away from the harshness that sometimes that ability,
Yes.
And I look at these Pharisees and I think, I could be one of them. Do you know what I mean? That's my problem. I could slip into that pretty easy.
Yeah. And
I have to fight the Pharisee. And Peterson's magnificent, unique insight into that actually when you're in church long enough, when you're in the club long enough, when you've held the law as Paul did and obeyed it faultlessly, blamelessly, you could get a little bit uppity, couldn't you? You could get a little bit
Yes.
superior. I mean, you would look at the sinner on the street and go, oh, I'm not like him.
Yeah.
I'm certainly, as one Pharisee in a parable of Jesus said in Luke's gospel, Lord, I thank you that I'm not like him,
Yeah.
looking at the publican. And I think it's in us all. And I think these parables are a reminder. I think the great disservice that preachers have done to this parable to the church is that we have put the emphasis squarely on the prodigal son, the son that went
Mm-hmm.
away. And then it becomes a very comforting little parable about someone who's gone away but will come back eventually. But actually, if the
Yes.
point of the parable ultimately was to challenge the in crowd
Yeah.
and say, actually, there's sins that you've developed while in the in crowd, then it becomes a deeply controversial and
Yes.
uncomfortable parable, and one that should move each of us to go, is the elder brother in me? Am I in him?
Well, even John, I'm thinking as I'm reading this just now, my brain's doing that thing that our brains do, where it starts trying to draw connections. I'm then drawn over to 1 Corinthians, where you've now got this early kind of Christian community, and they're starting to get a little bit of a, well, I'm a proper Christian because I came here by Paul. Well, no, I'm here by Apollos, and well, I'm of Peter, and you've got this. And Paul kind of wades in on this argument. It's like, what on earth are you all talking about? But there's just that little fascinating comment that he makes in verse 21 of chapter 3, where he says, so let no one boast about human leaders, for all things are yours, right? Whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas, which is Peter, or the world or life or death or the presence or the future, all belong to you. You belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to God. And again, I'm not trying to draw, this is what Luke has in mind, this is what, but there's that sense of, it's interesting that this problem continues then on into the church, and Paul's going like, why are you arguing about what you're arguing about right now? Don't you realize you're of Christ? Don't you realize that it all is yours? Like everything you have, it all belongs to you. I say this to people quite regularly, where people say, I just wish I could have more of God. and I understand what people are trying to say, and all language is metaphor, and that fails us. But I always love as a pastor to encourage them and go, tough. God has it all there for you. You can just choose not to take it. You never even gave me a goat, says the son. And the father says, well, it's all yours. It's all you. You can live in as much grace as you want. And there's almost that sense that the father's even saying to the son, you could have hosted this party. Like you're choosing to be like this. Paul's saying to the Corinthians, why are you arguing about some of this stuff? It's all yours. You've got as much of God as you want. You've got as much grace as you want. I'm the one that's controlling the tap of grace into my life, and I can just pull it if I want, and just let it all flood in and just be completely ruined by it, which I think is what Jesus is saying this father is. He's just ruined by grace. He just doesn't care. I'm going to run. That's undignified. I'm going to break all the social rules. I just want this son back in my house again.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
There's even a question, John, as to how lost he actually is, because the father seems to know where he is, because he's waiting for him, and he knows he's coming, and he's gone out to get him.
Yeah.
What do you do with grace, huh? What do you do with grace?
It's magnificent. It's magnificent, and I absolutely love all of that, and both sons speak to me deeply.
Yes.
And challenge me deeply.
You and I have worked in very similar contexts, although we both worked in the same, seminary context for a while, but we've also pastored. And I think about how often people say to me, I just feel like God doesn't want anything to do with me, or I just feel like I've done some stuff, and therefore I think I can't, connect with God anymore, and this is, and we create these reasons, and I always find myself drawn back to this story here, and as if Jesus is saying, well, what's your reason? What reason do you think is going to stop the Father running to you? And it's like there's this resistance in the human heart to grace. It's just like, no matter how often Jesus says it, we always feel there's a but. There's a but coming. Yeah, but if you knew what I had done, well, this son, he did some stuff, and the Father runs to him. Says, my son that was dead is now found.
Oh, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. And at every level, grace is magnificently, gloriously troublesome.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem fair. And somehow humans, we feel we need to do something to justify that grace. And, well, I did this, but God did this. But the story on both ends of the spectrum with both sons points to the fact, actually, it's everything about what the Father has done, what the Father provides, what the Father gives, and therefore what you can enjoy. All I have is yours, he said to the elder son. And when the younger son said, I'm happy to be your servant, none of it. No. Here's my robe. Here's the ring. Here's the shoes. Now come home. And that is all grace.
It's phenomenal. It's just so great. And even that sense, John, which still echoes out to all of us. By the time you get to the end of these parables, which son do you want to be? And all of us want to be the still smells of pig son, because you realize, that's what I want, and maybe I've got to lose some of my self-righteousness in order to find actual righteousness. I got to lose some of my self-justification in order to find grace, and I've got to carry the shame of actually just blowing it all. But in that beauty of when we blow it all, we find that God is there drawing us back towards himself.
So good.
Okay, that's it for episode 8. Thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. If you want to get in touch with either of us about something we said, you can reach out to us on podcast@twotexts.com or by liking and following the Two Texts podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you did enjoy the episode, we'd love it if you left a review or comment where you're listening from. And if you really enjoyed this episode, why not share it with a friend? And don't forget, you can listen to all our podcasts at twotext.com or wherever you get your podcasts. But that's it for this episode. We'll be back tomorrow, but until then, goodbye.